Right, so we're going to move on to something quite different. Though following up somebody who's worked with Michael Keaton in one of his best roles recently. That's Tom McCarthy's Stillwater, Scott. What is that all about?
Yes, well, Stillwater sees Oklahoma roughneck Bill Baker, played by Check's Notes Matt Damon. Well, all right then, if you must. Whose daughter Abigail Breslin's Allison is languishing in a Marseille jail after being convicted of killing her girlfriend, a crime that she denies. On one of his trips to visit, Allison gives Billy a letter to her lawyer saying that she's heard third-hand chatter that someone has bragged about being the real killer. Well, that's not enough for the lawyers to do anything with. It's enough for Bill to stay in Marseille and investigate. That's stymied a little by Bill not speaking much French, but he has some assistance from an acquaintance, Camille Coton's Virginie, who owes Bill a favour, and soon the two become friends, and more than that, despite the free-spirited theatre actress and the taciturn oil man having seemingly little in common. The investigation goes well, then poorly, with the suspects getting spooked and taking flight thanks to Bill's botched attempts, but another opportunity presents itself months later that leads to Bill taking rather more extreme actions to exonerate his daughter. To be clear, Stillwater is a fine enough film with a clutch of good performances and postcard pretty visuals in places, but I just could not get into this at all. While I've read that the wider point of this is not the crime investigation at all, but a look at how Bill and Allison deal with their guilt about the situation and the choices that's got them to this point, I just don't think there's enough shown of Bill's character to carry this off, and as Allison is barely in the film at all, that's not much of a help. At the risk of giving this a shorter shrift than it deserves, I just don't think I've got a great deal to say about Stillwater. It's not really doing anything I dislike. The closest it gets initially, Matt Damon seems a touch miscast, but he's a good enough actor to pull it off. It is, sadly, just not a film that could find any attack surface to get its hooks into me, so it's hard to think of this as anything other than, fine, which curiously makes it much harder to recommend than this episode's demonstrably worse Prisoners of the Ghostland, which at least had a car crash spectacle to it. Relentlessly average.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything you said, apart from that last bit, because this is a competent film with definable characters. Prisoners of the Ghostland, very much not that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, yeah, it's fine. I had wanted to watch this. It got a 5-minute standing ovation at Cannes. It had a lot of...
What do they put in the water at Cannes?
Yeah, that they do that. I don't know.
What? Sorry, what?
Most milquetoast films, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it had a lot of good press and stuff, and I was interested in it. And yeah, it's disappointing. It's well enough made, but I don't think there's any real insight into Bill Baker's character, which is kind of the point of the film.
Yeah.
And I know there was a lot of talk around it. It was like, oh, Matt Damon's playing this Trump supporter, and but he's not. He might be, but that doesn't actually come up.
Yeah.
And, well, the director has said that if he were to say who he voted for, he'd probably vote Republican, but there's a lot of things he does and says that suggest that, well, he certainly doesn't match up to the stereotypes of people who would vote for that party.
Yes, accent aside.
Yes.
Seems to be...
and perhaps, while Oklahoma's a very red state, perhaps people are a bit more, sophisticated or nuanced than something simply, well, he's from there and sounds like that and works as he does, well, he must vote for that. People are complex. And also not everybody in that state voted red, so it doesn't even come into it anyway, though. I think the more interesting thing around it, actually, is the whole Amanda Knox thing.
Yeah. I swung back and forward about actually writing about that. I can completely understand why she would be very upset about this without getting into spoilers. Well, actually, screw it. Let's spoiler it. She's quite upset about it because, well, the character in this is clearly based off her experiences, but to make the story a bit more interesting and a hook, they just made her guilty.
Yeah.
And I can imagine if I was someone who'd been through miscarriages of justice, that would probably make me a little bit annoyed. But ultimately, the film just... I didn't find it interesting enough to really draw much parallels into real life. So,
and also, sort of anything I've read up to date, she still hasn't seen it. So, I very much have to temper her opinion of it. But it's more just not specifically Amanda Knox, although clearly that was the thing. And Tom McCarthy has said in interviews, he said something like, she was a springboard to do it from, but no, you just kind of took the negative version of a story and used that for your story.
Yes.
It's rather than specifically Amanda Knox, it's kind of the more wider thing around. Like, I mean, do filmmakers or writers or anything have some sort of moral obligation to deal with these things well when you've so clearly based it on a true story? And the whole nonsense disclaimer that films tend to have at the end, which has always been bullshit and always will be bullshit, of the events and people depicted in this film are fictional and no reference to anything is intended or inferred. No, that's like it's something kind of legally boilerplate that they think covers you, but it's clearly nonsense. It always has been.
Yes.
The people and events portrayed in this film are entirely fictional and not based on any reality whatsoever. P.S. I shagged your mum. Ha ha.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's more kind of interesting from that point of view, because you take this thing and then you take this story and the way that people still feel about her. That think, oh well, no, she must have had something to do with it, even though that was never proven. And
there's no smoke without fire, Drew.
You've completely thrown me off my point there.
Yeah, that's how weak your defence is.
Yeah, so it's a reasonable discussion to be had, which I don't think we're going to have right now, but that there is some sort of moral or ethical responsibility you have if you're using something so real that could affect someone's life, or something to treat it differently, or the way Amanda Knox put it. And I don't know how you would do this necessarily, but it's like, if you're going to fictionalize my story, really fictionalize it, obscure it more perhaps. When it's like, oh no, it's not in Italy, it's in France. Oh, okay then, that's totally different.
It always rankles me that I do think there's a big conversation to be had about accountability and responsibility for this type of thing. That filmmakers can simply plead, well, it's made for entertainment purposes. Well, people who pretend that they have psychic powers are forced legally to represent themselves in this country, at least as being providing a service for entertainment purposes only. But do you know what? There are people who believe them and they make life decisions based on that. And unfortunately, those same people also watch films and draw conclusions from what is presented in films. It just strikes me as incredibly irresponsible. But you know how you guys were bombarding me with WhatsApp messages saying, Craig, subscriber numbers are plummeting. Please come back to the podcast. Do you remember those messages? Craig, your input is so valuable. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yes, I remember how dirty I felt sending them, but yes, I remember.
You remember, right, you remember. So obviously, my input is, you obviously value my input, and again, this is not a film I have seen, but I will say this. Scott, I'm really surprised that you follow the words Oklahoma Roughneck with Matt Damon and not Mark Wahlberg. And then I look at the poster for this movie, and I think, how is that Matt Damon's face and not the face of Mark Wahlberg?
Yes.
That's all I'm going to say. 3 out of 5.
Yeah.
I'm back, baby.
It's like you never left.
It's like I never left. Oh, God. It's like I never left.